Well, we're back for another episode, and for some of you, you might have spring open enrollment for employee benefits coming up in the next couple of months. Some of you might want to come back to this episode more towards the fall when your open enrollment happens for your employee benefits, or perhaps you're more like Elliott's clients and you might be retired and navigating some healthcare, you know, situations there, or just trying to figure out what's the best for you there. So we're going to talk about health plans, what to look out for, and also HSAs, the triple tax-free eighth wonder of the world. Well, I guess ninth, right?
My favorite type of account.
Yeah, the best thing under the sun since sliced bread. So why don't we kick things off with just a general thought process of some of the things we think about when looking at healthcare for our clients. Elliott, what are some of those initial conversations, concerns, things that you're thinking about when you talk about healthcare strategies with clients?
I'd love for you to start, actually, Matt, on this, since you've gone through open enrollment recently with quite a few clients. I want to know what you look at first.
Yeah, well, there's a lot. Well, there's a lot, but there's also not a lot, and so I'm gonna open that up a little bit. Many times when you're going through open enrollment with an employer, a lot of my clients too are self-employed, so sometimes we're looking at the healthcare marketplace. But if you're working for a traditional employer in a W-2 role, you're not usually going to have a ton of options or limitless options, it seems, to dig through. And a couple of the questions I really like to ask my clients is, what are you currently using that health plan for? Do you have like an ongoing chronic issue? Do you use the mental health benefits from that? What types of prescriptions are you using? How frequently are you actually using that health plan? And that will really help us understand, like, again, the main purpose of the health insurance, right, is to take care of you when you need it, not necessarily to save money or to save taxes, all that fun stuff. So those are some of the initial questions that I'm walking through with my clients. We can come more back to that. But how about you, Elliott? What are some of those initial questions that you're asking your clients?
Yeah, that's a great one. I'm probably also looking at, do they have access to a high deductible health plan and a normal plan? And or is there any other option there, which dovetails really nicely into your question, just trying to figure out how are you using healthcare to determine if they have options for healthcare plans, which ones might we start leaning towards?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times they don't. Well, what's that? What's a high deductible health plan, right? So sometimes it's just that's why I guess I start with some of those softer questions. But I think that's a really good next step to go. In terms of understanding what decision we want to make, and really understanding too, and looking at what is the in-network and out-of-network deductible. What are those in and out-of-network max out-of-pockets for a given calendar year, especially with the rise in virtual work. Sometimes, a company will be headquartered in one state, but they have employees in other states, and then all of your usage is going to be technically out of network, and that can be a really big setback or a really big, like, tough thing to get hit with, halfway through the year when you're like, oh shoot, like, this isn't the deductible I thought it was going to be. I only looked at the in-network one versus the out-of-network. And then two, just understanding how fast are you going to hit those deductibles, right? So understanding what your copay is or your co-insurance rate is on given procedures that you might be having. A lot of my clients are growing families and they're thinking about having a baby. So, if there is that known fact coming up, we might look at just going to the more premium or more comprehensive health plan for a year or two, just to make sure that mom and baby can get all the services that they need. And I think in a lot of those cases, you're going to come out ahead rather than focusing on saving taxes or premiums through a high deductible plan. What are some of those things you look for, Elliott, when thinking about a high deductible plan versus not?
Yeah, as you were going through all the things that you're like, baby, that sort of thing, payment, out of pocket, co-insurance. And I would just say if you're overwhelmed by these terms, we're not going to define all of them today, but I would encourage you to look them up to better understand them, because it will play into my next statement of I'm a spreadsheet person when it comes down to this, of modeling what is my premium, what is my employer contributing either to a high deductible health plan or not? Sometimes if you select the high deductible health plan, you'll get additional dollars from your employer for selecting that. And sometimes that can make it even cheaper than, I'm using air quotes here, but the normal plan or the more premium plan. And then running through, what is my medication cost? What am I paying as a copay to go see the doctor? Or how often do I anticipate that? That's really the only way for me to make sense of all this, both as a financial planner, but just as a human being trying to decide where are my dollars best allocated to with healthcare plans, given what I know about my healthcare. And obviously that can change year to year.
Yeah, no, I love that. And that is a huge piece, right? Like free money is great when you can get it from your employer. I mean, again, we're using air quotes with free for those of you listening along on the podcast. But also too, I think a really good question, and typically with our clients we know this, but for those of you listening, like what tax bracket are you actually in, right? And when I say actually in, like you have to understand that as you go through the tax brackets, you're not paying 22% on all of your income, but what that next dollar is going to be taxed at. And that's again where an HSA, the equation, right, and the calculation for what the actual benefit of taking that high deductible plan and what those tax savings are going to be, in addition to usually premium savings, can really be completely different. If you're in a high tax bracket versus a lower one.
Yeah. The other thing I would add, sort of along the line of finances, but a little bit separately, is what setting do you want to get care? And what I mean by that is, do you want lots of options or do you want fewer options where there's some gatekeeping? And the big one there is sometimes there's health maintenance organizations where you have to see your PCP or your primary care provider, and then they refer you out to everybody from there. So it can be harder sometimes to get those referrals than just a bread and butter like a preferred provider organization or PPO, where you can go see the people that you want to see. There's less gatekeeping with that. I think that's important to keep in mind, both where you're working and, Matt, to your point, virtually, are you out? I'm on a healthcare plan right now where if it's not an emergency and I go see someone that's out of network there, that bill can be very high and insurance may not cover all of it or a good portion of that. So there's always a risk embedded within that.
Yeah, and that's a really good point too. And it's one of those questions like, do you see a lot of specialists? Like I constantly have like allergy and sinus issues, and I got a lot of ear infections as a kid, and I still have some of those issues. So like I honestly like I just want to skip the nonsense and be able to go to my provider. Like that to me is a lot more valuable than being able to save into an HSA, but that's just my preference, right?
Yeah.
And really what your experience is with your health plan and your healthcare needs, right? I think it's a lot like saving for retirement or even trying to reduce taxes. Don't let the tax tail wag the dog, right? Like get healthcare for what you need healthcare for. Don't worry primarily about how much tax it's going to save you or the tax-free benefits of an HSA. But
definitely.
Yeah, anything you'd want to add to that, Elliott, before we maybe pivot to, some of the fun things about HSAs? I won't tear them apart forever.
Nothing I would add. I'm sure we're missing something just because of the complexity of healthcare that I feel confident there's something missing. So if you know of something, feel free to let us know and we can include that in a future episode on something.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Elliott, you started off with HSAs and high deductible plans. So why don't you give us like a rundown of what the heck is an HSA? How am I eligible for one? What are those other accounts like FSAs and, these various savings accounts that I can contribute to through my employer, and how does that impact my eligibility for an HSA?
Yeah, so I love health savings accounts, or HSAs for short, if it makes sense in the context of your healthcare and everything else that we just talked about. Because as you talked about, Matt, it's triple tax advantage. So you get a tax deduction going in, taxes are deferred / tax free, and then your withdrawals are tax free, I should say, when you take it out for qualified medical expenses, and that can be deferred for a really long time. You can also take it out for things that happened in the past. So I've worked with folks in the past where I say, hey, keep a spreadsheet, keep your receipts, and maybe invest the HSA. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Have decades go by. And then if you want to reimburse yourself for a medical expense you had 20 years ago, that's perfectly okay. So they provide a lot of flexibility, a lot of tax benefits with that, and can be used throughout your life or in retirement.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, when Elliott says tax deferred, what he's saying too is, as that grows, hopefully your HSA, most of them do have the ability to invest those funds. You're not going to have to like pay taxes on the growth every year or anything like that. And if you use it for the qualified medical expense, you never have to pay the tax on those dollars. So for those of you who know what a Roth IRA is, it's kind of like that with the pre-tax benefit of a traditional IRA, only if you use it for medical expenses. So
Yeah.
that's like the simplest way to explain it. But yeah, for a full list of what is and is not eligible, you can also just Google like IRS HSA qualified expenses, and there's a whole pamphlet on it for the IRS. So if you want to make sure that it is covered, you can check there too.
And it's pretty flexible. If you look at the list, you can almost always fit something that you buy every single year, even if you're not a big consumer of healthcare. At this point, I don't know who's not in some ways, but there's plenty of options.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of them too, like if you do need to use it, right? We're not saying don't use it if you can't afford to not use it, right? Like the real power of that account is letting it grow over time. But even if you can save, again, if we're just using a sample 22% tax bracket on those out-of-pocket medical expenses, that's a really nice benefit to have too. So use it if you have to, but avoid it if you can, I think would be the general words of wisdom there.
Yeah. And I would say, as you look at your HSA and your plan provider, maybe we'll get a little bit into the weeds here, is that some plan providers allow you to invest it, some don't. Some leave it in a savings account earning practically nothing. So that's something to look at. And you can actually roll out money from an HSA from your employer plan, like make all your contributions there. So you get the tax deduction, you get the payroll tax deduction, all that good stuff. But then you could theoretically roll it out on an annual basis, just as an example, to another provider that allows you to invest it. And then you can have a whole suite of options typically on that are less limited by whatever your employer plan provides.
Yeah. Yeah. And two, I know a lot of people have access to HSAs now, but sometimes there will be something called an FSA, which is not at all the same thing. I'm not a big fan of them, Elliot. I'll let you go first. Maybe you have different feelings, but an FSA is more for incidental expenses that you would have along the year for a specific set of categories. Do you want to talk a little bit more about those, Elliot?
Yeah, so flexible savings accounts or FSAs, they can be good if you're more certain about what you're going to spend in a year. The problem with these accounts is they're primarily use it or lose it. If your employer allows you to roll over some dollars, sometimes that can go into the next year for a certain period of time that you then have to spend it. But for the most part, you have to use it in the calendar year. So you don't want to contribute necessarily more than you feel really confident that you'll spend it, because it's pretty lousy to put in, say, $100 into this thing and you don't end up using the $100. It's just, hey, the $100 disappeared. But again, there's a lot of different options for how to use that. So oftentimes online, you'll see posts of like, hey, I have X dollars left in my FSA. How should I spend that? And people list out medical expenses that are outside the norm of, hey, I'm going to the doctor. So there are ways to get around that, but it's just something that you have to monitor a little bit closely. And they don't have super high contribution limits. So you have to decide what your time is worth here.
Yeah. And the limit is higher than what can be rolled over for that certain period of time. So if you do end up making a max contribution and not really using it, some of your money will just poof, right? It's basically gone. And that's something too where you can look that up every year because it gets adjusted for inflation and all those things. But another good tip, if you do have that type of account, you're like, hey, I haven't really used this. You can actually go to Amazon or a lot of like Walgreens and a lot of these online pharmacies. They will have, an FSA approved page where you can, stock up on some medical supplies or, over the counter type medicines that you might need, which can be a really good way to use that. They have cracked down a lot in recent years, though. You can't like buy like 3 years worth of something just because you have money left over. They do say like reasonably would use, right? So just be careful on some of those things. But it can be a good way to chew up some of that money if you haven't used it and don't plan on doing that in the following calendar year.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are some other, I guess they're not necessarily like medical benefits, but just on the topic, like, I guess one question that I ask my clients, especially those with kids, like, do they plan on going to daycare or having some type of after school supervision, right? And for a lot of them, the answer is yes. And daycare has gotten atrociously expensive. So that might be something too, just in thinking through the health plan. Like, are there other places that you would want to save and use some of those dollars that may not be the HSA? And again, when I go back to my clients, they do have high daycare expenses. So making something like, dependent care, um, FSA, where they can use that to pay for daycare and reimburse themselves for daycare expenses on a tax-free basis, essentially, can be really powerful, and that would impact their ability to make the full use of that HSA account. And that's where, again, we just look at more medical needs with kids and being able to get some tax benefits in a different way. That can be a really powerful way too, if you don't necessarily feel like you're gonna use or can fully fund that HSA, just to look at some of those ancillary benefits that can still save you on the tax at least, and still have that higher value plan.
Yeah. Are there any other common or maybe more unique things that you've seen as you've run across employer benefits that you want to make sure people take advantage of or at least be aware of?
Um, I mean, so here in Wisconsin, like my wife, she's part of the Wisconsin retirement system. So like, if we get a physical and do these checklist of things, like you get the $150 gift card, which, I mean, again, it's free money, right? So that's for each of us, a total of $300. And that can be put towards vacation or going out for a date or something like that. Also, like a lot of companies, they're encouraging wellness. And I think this is really trickling down from the health insurance companies, where they have an incentive to keep people healthy. So, sometimes your gym membership can be either fully reimbursed or discounted if you have, the employee health plan. HRAs are another option too, right? So it's a little bit of a higher tier health plan, but your employer is still going to make some contribution and give you some free money to have that plan versus not being able to make those contributions to a HSA. Um, yeah, I don't know. Are there any other ones that come to mind for you, Elliot? Or I guess if you don't have anything else, I would be curious. What has your experience been with using some of those HSA funds with your clients, like in retirement? Like, what are they using that for? Like, do they use all of it? That's a question I get from my younger clients all the time. Like, am I really going to need this much money in retirement for healthcare? And what the heck can I even spend this on when I get to retirement? Is it just those past health expenses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one of those things where it doesn't necessarily have to be care in retirement, right? It could be expenses that you had along the way. And that's why I really like the HSA, because you don't really lose anything by waiting to do that, because you can always reimburse yourself, assuming you have proof for it, for past expenses. So for a lot of my clients, some are, when they come to me, using those HSA dollars. And then we have the conversation of, well, what would happen if we stopped that? You paid out of pocket from other resources, allowed that tax-free growth to happen for another decade or two. Well, that's great. You can always go back and pay yourself for those other expenses. Or I'm of the mindset, at least for healthcare in this country for the foreseeable future, doesn't look like it's getting any cheaper. I honestly think those expenses are going to be around for a while. I'm not really worried about spending that. I mean, the only downside is if you pass away while you still have the account, it's going to a non-spouse, then it becomes taxable. But for most people with a normal life expectancy, even if in your 60s, again, a personal decision, but you could theoretically invest this for another decade or two. You have 5 or 10 grand or even more in your HSA. I mean, that could be $100,000 plus for tax-free distributions to either reimburse yourself for that thing or anything else. And that's the thing to keep in mind. You don't have to spend it on
Mm-hmm.
something, right? You can reimburse yourself for a past expense and then go use it to get, I don't know, go on a month-long trip to Europe or something. As long as you are showing what you've spent money on, you can take it out for anything. So I'm a big fan personally of deferring it. That's what I'm personally doing from the time that when I made HSA contributions, and plan to not spend it for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think it is kind of a weird thing to think about, right? Because you're like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
like I guess I did spend all that money way back when, and now I just get it inflation adjusted and hopefully a little bit more with some decent investment returns, right? So
Yeah, it's definitely a weird account to think about, but a very powerful one.
yeah, and two, I know you already said this, but like, put it in Google Drive, put it in. I mean, we keep it in our clients' vaults, like for their medical expenses. It's not like there's much detail on there, but you have the receipt, you have the payment. Just keep all those things handy, and when you get to retirement, you can kind of give yourself a little, retirement present, right? With reimbursing yourself for all those cuts and scrapes and ear infections along the way. So
Yeah. So I would put a plug here just really quickly. I have an HSA blog article on my website, kindnessfp.com/blog. If you search HSA, I actually have a template for a spreadsheet. So if you want to track that along the way, that's how I somewhat do mine. I won't say I'm perfect at it, but I do try to throw my expenses on there, do either camera screenshot or PDF to just track those expenses and track it by years. That way, if you ever get audited for this, like let's say you take a really large distribution, IRS comes knocking and says, "Hey, what's this $50,000 distribution from your HSA this year? How do you substantiate that?" You can go, "Okay, here are all my documents." And you don't have to go back and try to piece that together.
yeah, yeah. And another thing, just as you were saying that, like it kind of popped into my head, like more on the retirement side, but that's something too, where if you do ultimately retire early and you don't have, employer insurance that's going to go with you throughout retirement, which is, I feel like, becoming all less common and practically extinct at this point in time. It could help you save some money on government marketplace, out of pocket costs too, and just having like some extra tax free cash on the side to help offset, maybe not going to the gold or the platinum level, but if you're on that silver level plan and are already getting those subsidies, you can also supplement some of that, out of pocket costs if there is any at that time, to help just have some tax free cash that's not going to, you know, really impact your ability to do something like a Roth conversion or,
Yeah. Nobody's ever complained
all
about
that good
having
stuff.
flexibility with some tax-free dollars.
Yeah, not at all. So the only thing I think we forgot is just a side note, like if you do have an HSA, you can't have both an HSA and an FSA, right? Right, Elliot? Yep. So I'm pretty sure that's in the definition of the HSAs. You're not usually allowed to have an FSA at the same time. So don't rob yourself of that benefit by using that less advantaged account.
Yeah. Oh,
For
and
sure.
I think the other thing we forgot is being eligible for a high deductible health plan. There's certain requirements that you'll need to look that you have a certain out of pocket that's above a certain amount, but actually below another amount. And that's a key to keep in mind. Sometimes with the
Mm-hmm.
wildness of healthcare plans today, some healthcare plans actually have a too high of an out of pocket maximum that it doesn't qualify for a high deductible health plan, which is a weird intricacy that probably shouldn't exist, but just look up the rules for how you qualify because they are special rules.
And I'm going to say, especially so if you're young and maybe you aren't quite like at an employer that has health benefits, or if you're self employed, be mindful of that when you're looking at the government marketplace. They've done a lot better of saying like, hey, this is too high of a deductible and is not eligible for an HSA. But I made that very mistake, Elliot, when I graduated. I was like, yes, I got like the cheapest health plan that I could find, and I'm young and healthy and don't use it. I can do an HSA. And then I was wrong. So just make sure you check that. And again, usually it's a bullet point now on those government options. Your employer most certainly will tell you whether or not you have access to an HSA. If they don't, like, I don't see how that happens. I guess it could happen, but it should say that in your benefits package straight up. And most of the time they'll be making some type of a contribution there. So if you see that language, it should be eligible.
Yeah, good points.
A lot less can go wrong when you have those employee benefits, but yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, hopefully you all found this helpful. I know it's complicated. No two health plans are the same. Those premiums are probably going to change in the wrong way, every year and go up in cost. So those are things that, again, you'll just have to reevaluate each and every year when you get those open enrollments. And again, I just encourage you to look forward at what am I going to be doing in the next 12 months that may change how I'm going to use this health plan or what I'd want to actually use it for. And I'm sure you'll do great. But if you have any questions, you can click in the show notes. You can reach out to Elliott or I. Elliott, we can probably just link that spreadsheet right in the show notes too, right?
There's a
Just
good idea.
to your website. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll put that in the show notes. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you have any questions for a future episode, you can fill out the Google form there, and we'll do our best to tackle those in the months to come. Thanks
Great.
for joining again today, Elliott.
Thanks, Matt. Good to see you.